Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our next lecture for Fundamentals of Music. And as you can see from the title of this video, today we are talking about triads. And we have some backstory that is useful, I think, when talking about triads, because that might be a term you're familiar with, or it might be one you are not familiar with. So let's go ahead and first of all, just kind of talk a little bit about musical chords, because triads are a form of a musical chord. So a musical chord, is something you might be used to hearing, like, oh, that's a G minor chord, or that's a D power chord, or, if you play piano, or if you play the guitar or other instruments where you're doing a lot of like multiple pitches at once, or you're creating some of those common chords, you might be somewhat familiar with that term. For the time being, let's just define the term chord as really like any two or more pitches, so 2+ pitches. So if I just play C, we're not going to call that a chord, but if I play C and G, well, maybe that's a chord. Or, it could be something less traditional. It could be, that. And, sometimes some people might say that a chord is like 3 or more pitches, and that any like 2 notes is really just that. It's like that interval, we can kind of think of it that way. But a chord for our time being, we'll say, is the simultaneous performance or playing of 2 or more pitches, okay? And triads, as we mentioned, are just a really common version of chords, but we can have a lot more. And, in the future, you may learn about other types of chords. For example, that can be a chord, or just some large cluster of pitches. There's a lot of different ways in which we can define and sort of use that word chord. But today we are focusing on the triad, which you can imagine based off the name, that is a specific type of chord with 3 pitches. We will, in future courses, talk about chords with more than, and like talk about, chords with 4 pitches and 5, etc. But for now, we will just stick to 3 pitches per chord, and that will be our triad. So, back in the day when music was really kind of being invented, which is funny, we don't really think about that, but all of this stuff had to come from somewhere. Music has been a part of human culture going really far back, but the idea of, multiple pitches sounding at once, and the sort of sounds and the tuning systems and the chords and the structures that we have come up with, those aren't, those had to happen organically and over time, and it took quite a while to sort of get to where we are now. So back in the day, in like the medieval and Renaissance eras, really a lot of music was just one note at a time. It would be what we call monophonic, one voice singing, and it's just, just one note at a time. That's all there was for a while. At least in some contexts, especially in like church music, which is hugely influential for Western classical music. But at a certain point, people started to combine voices, and we really had an emphasis on things like the perfect octave, which I mentioned before, or the perfect fifth. The perfect fifth became a really important interval historically for a lot of like church and Renaissance music and medieval era music. And, that means, what I'm playing right now is I'm just playing like C and G, which is that interval of a perfect fifth. It's kind of got that nice open sound. And then after a few hundred years of that sound being a really big deal, and I'm kind of giving you the 101 here, but that is generally speaking true. Someone said, hey, hold on. What if we added this pitch at the same time? And what if we played all 3 of them at the same time? And I know it seems funny, like, of course, why wouldn't we do that? But it took a long time for someone to like consciously come up with these systems, come up with these sounds, write it down, say it was okay, have the approval of the church. And we ended up sort of landing on this sound, which is, this thing that I'm playing right here. Okay, now in this case, that happens to be a C major chord, which you might know, and if you do, great, we'll define it and talk about it in a second. But this is an example of a triad, and that's sort of how it historically came about. It was like, oh, we have one note. Well, then let's add another, a perfect fifth apart, because that's one of our perfect consonant intervals, and that's acceptable. And then, someone was like, well, you know what? There's another really great note in between. Let's add it. And we get that lovely triad sound. So this is an example of a triad. It is 3 notes, and they're typically a third apart between each note. And again, it will sound like that. That happens to be a major triad. We will also have minor triads. We will have diminished triads. And we will also have augmented triads. We will briefly touch on all 4 of those types of triads today, but primarily we are focusing on just the major and minor triad today. And one of your tasks at hand is to be, I will give you one single pitch, and then you need to create a triad from that pitch. So that's sort of what we're going to aim for today. So one of the best ways to introduce this idea of triads, I think, is to go back to the major or minor scale. But let's start with the major scale, as we have often done. So let's just go ahead and work in C major for a little while. And let's add the notes of our musical alphabet in an ascending fashion. And I'll just stop right there because we don't need to repeat the octave in this instance. So all of the notes that we would use to make triads in a C major key signature are already here, because these are all the notes of C major: C, D, E, F, G, A, B. Doesn't mean we won't later build triads with other notes than these and notes from outside the scale, but for quite a while, we are going to stick to these notes as sort of our harmonic palette. And harmony is really just that. It's more than one voice sounding at a time. So sort of like I was talking about before, we used to have one voice, which was monophonic. Then we had polyphony, which is multiple voices. And suddenly we had harmony. And then one form of harmony became this triad. So when we have these notes in front of us, if we want to create the sort of harmonic players, the primary triads and chords of the C major scale, and by extension, any other scale, major or minor, all we have to do is stack thirds above any one of these notes. And when we stack chords in thirds, so we have a note, and then we have a third above it, and then a third above that, and we could continue, but for now we're going to limit to 3 pitches. There's a special term for that type of harmony, and it is what we call tertian harmony, which means like thirds. Just to give you an example, in the future you might discuss secundal harmony, like the word second, so chords being stacked in seconds, or quartal harmony, stacked in fourths, or quintal harmony. The idea of stacking pitches in thirds, though, became a really, really common way to go about creating chords, and it's still, probably by far the most common sort of way of structuring chords. So what I'm talking about in terms of the scale here, in C major scale, is I could just take these notes, and I could just write, if my note starts on a line, then I could add 2 more notes on the lines above it, and if I start on a space, I could add a note on the next 2 spaces above. So I'm literally just stacking thirds. Notice how each of these notes are a third apart from each other. We could also say the same is true here, and I could just continue upward, and I could stack thirds above each of the notes of my major scale. Notice I haven't added any accidentals. These are just the same notes. So in other words, I didn't add any new pitches here. I added E and G right here, but I already had E and G. And over here I added C and E, but I also already have C and E. So again, I'm not adding new pitches, I'm just stacking them on top of each other. And in this case, it's going to end up sounding like this. And then I could bring it back up, back to where we started, just 1 octave higher. So these are like the chords of the C major scale, or in particular, they are the triads of the C major scale. And I'm able to construct those just by stacking thirds. So this is an example of creating triads. Triads are a form of harmony because they have multiple notes sounding at once. And in this case, these triads are tertian because we are building them stacked in thirds. Each pitch is 1/3 higher than the last until we have created a triad. Now, in terms of the quality of the chords that we create by stacking thirds just from the notes of the C major scale, the tonic note would build a major chord. In other words, if we just start on our tonic pitch and stack thirds upward, it will always create a major scale if we are in a major key signature, which is going to be handy for us because we're going to use that logic to help construct chords, and particularly triads, in a minute. If we stack thirds on my second scale degree, we would get a minor triad. So D, F, and A happens to be a minor triad. E, G, and B is also a minor triad. My 4th scale degree generates a major triad. My 5th generates a major triad. My 6th scale degree generates a minor triad. And then my last triad, built on B, will create a diminished triad. And we use like a little symbol, this little circle, to mean diminished. We could also sometimes use lowercase d, but sometimes you'll end up seeing something like, if it was a B diminished chord, we might have the letter B and then this little circle up next to it, which would mean diminished. The one that is not included here is like augmented, which is a little plus symbol. We will not naturally create an augmented triad from any of the sort of stacked thirds of the major scale. We also won't in the minor scale. So the augmented triad is a little bit more rare in a lot of sort of classical Western music, but we will see major triads, minor triads, and a diminished triad. And again, those would sound as major triad, minor, and notice how, the major triad sounds a little brighter and happier, at least to sort of our, sort of acculturation to that sound. And the minor triad, perhaps a little more tragic or somber. Another minor triad, then two major triads in a row. Another minor triad. And then lastly, our diminished triad. And then back to a major triad if we go all the way back up. We'll continue to expand greatly upon our definition of these types of triads and how they relate to each note in the very near future, but I just want to show you where these triads are coming from. We're just stacking notes in thirds from the scale or the key that we are currently in. And you'll also note, much like I was talking about before, when I create a major scale and I have to make sure I include one of every letter of the musical alphabet, otherwise it's not going to be a scale. Like we are never going to have a scale that includes C and then C sharp and then D and then D flat. Like we're not going to have multiple instances of the same letter note. We're only going to have one of each. You'll notice that when building triads, we also only ever have one of each note type, and they're always a third apart. So for now, when we are creating our triads, you won't have like C and then D and then G, okay? Because those aren't a third apart. So anytime you're asked for now, and we will slightly tweak this in the future, but what I'm saying does generally always remain true. Anytime you're given a note, and if I say build a triad, just stack thirds above it. So if it starts on a space, add notes on the next two spaces above. If it starts on a line, add notes on the next two lines above. Again, we will tweak that slightly when I ask for more specific inversions of triads, as we will discuss, but you can always create a triad that has the three right notes as long as you start on the lowest note of the triad and stack thirds upward. So that should be true all the time. So for now, make sure you don't turn in anything that looks like that if you are asked to write a triad, because two of these notes are on lines and one is on a space, and that's going to give us some degree of incorrectness in what I'm asking for. So with that information in mind, let's talk about just an individual triad in a little bit more detail. And in this case, let's start with our C major triad, which sounds as such. As before, it has the notes C, E, and G, and as mentioned, that would be a C major triad. So let's talk about the anatomy of this chord just in and of itself, and then we'll also talk about the C minor triad, lowercase m for minor, which will sound as such. We'll talk about how these are each constructed, how one is similar to the other, how they're different, and we'll also talk about how you can create these two chords starting on any pitch anytime you need to. Again, we will save the diminished triad and the augmented triad for a future lecture. We already did briefly play the diminished triad, but for today, let's just focus on these two forms of the triad. So if we look at this structure here, we can think of it in a couple of different ways. We could define the distance between each individual pitch and the next pitch, and we've started to talk about intervals, and we could say that the distance from C to E is a major third, and we could also say the distance from E to G is a minor third, which just means one step smaller, one half step smaller than a major third. So it's just a semitone or a half step or a minor second smaller. So the distance, in other words, from C to E, if I play C, and then I go up a half step, that's one, up another, two, up another, three, up another, four. We could say that the distance from C to E is 4 half steps apart if we wanted to count those on the piano, while the distance from E to G is only 3 half steps apart. So it's just 2/3 smushed together. It's a major third and then a minor third stacked on top of each other. That's a good way to define what a major triad is. It's a major third and then a minor third. And then you play it all at once and you end up with this sound. However, especially since we haven't talked a ton about the minor third yet, although from context, it's pretty easy to recognize it's just one step smaller, one half step smaller than a major third. But the way I tend to define the major triad is instead think of everything relative to the lowest note. So if I start with C and then I add E, we can say that that is a major third apart. And if I add G, we can say that that is a perfect fifth apart. So I like to reference everything relative to that lowest note. So C up to E is a major third, and C up to G is a perfect fifth. And if I take a note and add a major third above it and then a perfect fifth above it, I get the sound that is the major triad. So that's my kind of preferred way to define what the interval structure is of a major triad. The minor triad is very similar, and again, we could think of it in two different ways. We could think of the distance from C to E flat now as a minor third, because it is 1/2 step smaller of a distance between C and E flat than between C and E over here, so it becomes a minor third. But since the E flat went down 1/2 step and the G stayed the same, that means this interval is now larger, and it actually becomes a major third. So we can talk about how a minor triad is nothing more than a minor third and then a major third. So they both contain the same two intervals, just stacked in different order. So we get the major triad sound on the left, and we get the minor triad sound on the right, which again can sound a little more tragic or somber. We have very important terms for the three notes of these triads, regardless of whether they're major or minor. Whatever the lowest note of my triad is, in this case C, we call that the root of the note. Whatever my middle note is, in this case E flat, if I'm looking at the minor triad, that is called the third. And the top note of the triad is going to be, you can probably guess it, the fifth. So it is a fifth apart. That's why I kind of like to think about it this way. Reference the intervals from the root, not like root to third and then third to fifth. I think root to third and root to fifth, because it holds true over here as well with the minor triad. I could say that the distance from C to E flat is a minor third, and I could say that the distance from C to G is a perfect fifth. So when in doubt, when defining major and minor triads, if you can just keep this little bit of information in mind and this little bit of information in mind, you're going to be off to a great track. Start with your root note, add a major third, add a perfect fifth. Or again, with the minor third, with the minor triad, start with your root note, add a minor third, add a perfect fifth. Get you a minor triad every single time. So then, the last thing to talk about is how you are going to go about creating triads if I ask you for something. So for example, on an upcoming homework assignment, you might just see something like, what is an A flat major triad? And I'll give you a space and you just need to write that. Well, let's think about it step by step. It's an A flat major triad. We know it has to have A flat, so let's add an A flat. And as I mentioned, we know we just stack thirds upwards. So let's just add a couple notes that are thirds apart, one in each space. Versus if I'd asked for, like G, well then we would have added B and D because it would be 3 lines. But I asked for A flat, so we don't have to worry about those notes right now. But I'm already suspiciously far in terms of getting this correct, and it took almost no thought at all. I realized I needed A flat, so I added an A flat, and then I know I'm going to stack thirds above it, so I just added 2 thirds above that note. Or another way I could think about it is I added a third and then I added a fifth. So our job then, if this is a major triad that I am asking for, we need to make sure that we have above A flat a major third and also above A flat a perfect fifth. So we have a couple of ways we can handle it. Well, one, we can just start memorizing intervals and or counting half steps. I happen to know the distances between A flat and C and A flat and E and A flat and E flat and A flat and C flat and all these possible, combinations. I just kind of know which ones are major and minor thirds and perfect and diminished and augmented fifths. And as time goes on, you will really be surprised at how quickly you start to just memorize these triad structures. But if it's not immediately apparent to you, we can use a strategy very similar to what we talked about when just building intervals. So if I ask for an A flat major triad, well, we know that if we were in A flat major, and this was our tonic, our first scale degree, that if we just stacked thirds above it that were in the key of A flat major, it will give us an A flat major triad. Because just like in C major, if I have C and I just stack thirds above it, well, of course, it's going to be a major triad because that is the nature of that scale. If I'd asked for a minor triad, well, then you would just stack thirds above starting on C, but use the notes of the minor scale. So this is another reason why it's really, really important to have your major key signatures memorized. Do you know what A flat major is? How quickly can you determine what the key signature of A flat major is? Hopefully you already know it. If you don't know, you need to practice and drill until you have that. You may recall that the key signature of A flat major is 4 flats. Again, I can tell because the second to last flat tells me what key I'm in a major key signature based off flats. It's a very good trick that I would have memorized. So all I have to do then is look at what notes, what flats are in the key signature, and then ask myself, are any of these in the triad I'm being asked to write? Well, B flat is not over here because I have A, C, and E. A flat, well, that's already given to me because I know I have to start on A flat. Well, there's no D, so I don't have to make D flat. And then, aha, we have E flat. So I should bring that over and make this A flat, C, E flat. And if I play A flat, and then C, and then E flat, I get that sound of a major chord. So if you have a piano in front of you, or keyboard, or a software instrument, anything that lets you play that, just audition the chord you wrote. And if it sounds happy, well, you probably got a major triad. If it sounds sad, probably don't have a major triad, and you should be sad because you wrote the wrong chord. Okay? Let's do another example. So here I'm asking for an F sharp minor triad. So you might be given something like this. You're given a clef, some blank space, and you need to write out what is an F sharp minor triad. So let's go through the exact same steps again. Add an F sharp because we know we need that, and then stack some thirds above it. We're already halfway there. Now we can do a couple of things. We can make sure that this is a minor third and that this is a perfect fifth. So again, we could just look at those intervals and ask, well, is F sharp to C a perfect fifth? You might recall, as I talked about before, unless we're using the notes F and B, if we want to create a perfect fifth, they should have the same accidentals side by side, and in this case, they do not. So we can already probably tell there's something amiss with this F sharp to C not being a perfect fifth. We can also ask, is F sharp to A minor third? In this case, it does happen to be, which is great, and we can pretty quickly just count 3 half steps. I mean, F sharp to G is 1, G to G sharp is 2, and G sharp to A is 3, so we could pretty quickly determine that that is a minor third. If you're quick at recognizing intervals and seeing that this is or is not a minor third and this is or is not a perfect fifth, cool, you've got your triad. But again, I think the slightly better method is to, again, add F sharp, add the 2/3 above it, and then ask myself, what is the key signature of F sharp minor? If you do not know, memorize. You need to know that. You need to be able to very quickly determine that F sharp minor is 3 sharps, which include F sharp, C sharp, and G sharp. So we just need to pretend that we are now in F sharp minor and that this is my first scale degree. And I ask myself, okay, well, F sharp, that's a given. C sharp, got to bring that over. And then G sharp is not part of this chord, so I don't have to worry. And look, I have F sharp, A, and C sharp, which will sound as, which sounds an awful lot like a minor triad to me because it kind of sounds a little bit more tragic. So that is the approach that I highly recommend you take when creating triads. So remember those definitions. You can think of a major triad as a major third and then a minor third, or you can think of it as a major third and perfect fifth to the outside note. You can also think of a minor triad as a minor third and then a major third on top, or a minor third with a perfect fifth on the outside. That's a good way to define those individual chords, but to write them, to write triads, having it relative to a key signature really helps you get the correct accidentals that you need. So in the future, we will expand upon our definition to include a couple more forms of triads, namely the diminished and augmented triad, but go ahead and dive in and start creating triads on your upcoming assignment.